Hello and welcome. Today we will be replacing this 2014 Nissan Pathfinder's rear brake pads. The average cost of getting a brake pad replacement at a shop is $150 per axle. I was quoted $220. Our cost today came out to $49.99 plus tax for the pads and gel. There were cheaper pads at $37, which I could have gotten, or the $65 pads, but the cheap ones had bad reviews and apparently tend to create more brake dust. And the $65 ones, on the other hand, were basically identical to the $49 ones in every way that counts. Of course, the price will go up if you have to buy tools for the project. Make sure to calculate that into the price of doing it yourself. If you've got to buy several $100s worth of stuff and you're only going to do one project, it's probably not worth it. But if you're going to do multiple projects with these tools, you can spread that cost across all of them. The tools and supplies we ended up needing was a wrench set for the lug nuts and caliper nuts, brake pads, brake grease and gel, caliper guide pin grease and gel, which if you buy the right brand can be the same product for both, shop towels, gloves, jack stands, and wheel chalk to keep the vehicle from rolling away while we work on it. Optional, if you want to do the pads and the rotors instead of just the pads, or if you want to do the caliper pins as well, you can buy the new rotors, new guide pins, a hammer just in case the rotors get stuck. Brake parts cleaner is a definite, and you might need a breaker bar as well. We didn't need any of those tools because I didn't have to change my rotors. All I had to do was swap these pads and we were golden. Which helps because on this particular vehicle, there's kind of a bar in the way of popping off the caliper hardware that will stop you from being able to get the rotors off unless you want to take all of the caliper hardware. First step is to chuck the wheels and set up your jack and jack stands. You want to make sure you do this safely and to know where the safe points to lift your car up are. Doing this incorrectly can cause severe amounts of damage to your car and to you. Next is to break your lug nuts, then lift the car and adjust your jack stands for safety. I'm using my impact wrench or impact gun because I don't feel like hurting myself popping these off with a 4-way. You can do it with a 4-way, you can do it with a breaker bar, you can do it with an impact wrench. You should mark the wheel position so that you can put the wheel back on in the same position for balancing. You should do this because when you've last changed your tire at a shop, they should have balanced the wheel for you. And if you keep this mark, you won't have to rebalance the wheel. It's already balanced. It just goes right back on. No muss, no fuss. Finish removing the wheel, and if you feel the need to, you can put it under the side of the vehicle for extra protection in case your jack or jack stands fail. Break the nuts on the caliper. If you're having a hard time taking the caliper nuts off, use a little bit of oil before breaking out the impact wrench or breaker bar. Work smarter, not harder. Remember, anytime you use oil or any other lubricant when working with the brakes, that you need to clean it up and make sure none of it gets on the rotors or the pads. If there is oil on the rotors or the pads when it's reassembled, you're going to have a bad time. Once the caliper guide pins are loose, remove the top one and set it to the side where it will not come into contact with any dust or debris. Because I'm going to be replacing this caliper guide pin completely, that's not so much of a problem for me, but it is something for you guys to look out for any part that needs grease on it, to try to avoid adding any dust or debris into it. Slide the bottom pin out. There is a bar in the way, stopping it from coming all the way out on this model vehicle. Luckily, to replace the brakes, this one doesn't have to come all the way out. If you were replacing the rotors and pins, you could compress the spring to be able to remove the pin. It's much safer to just remove these caliper housing nuts and pop the whole housing off without having to mess with this bar. But because we're only replacing the top caliper pin and the brake pads, we don't have to mess with any of that. So just keep that in mind if you're going to replace the rotors or both caliper pins. Now rotate the caliper on the bottom pin to gain access to the pads. It should just hang there, so you don't even have to have anything to hold the hardware in place. Remove the pads and clean the clips and caliper with brake parts cleaner as needed. Mine aren't actually in that bad a shape, so I'm just going to leave it as is and maybe wipe it up with a shop towel whenever we're all done. Make sure you have that done before reassembly, and make sure that you don't get any liquids, grease, or really anything else between the pads and the rotor, as that will make you have a bad time. I'm actually going to leave the clips in place as they look clean and they appear to be in good shape. It's time to put the pads back in place. Make sure you have them at the correct orientation as the pads that you took off. Just slide them right in. It shouldn't be very difficult at all. If you have to force them in there, something is wrong. So take them out, sanity check what you're doing, and make sure you have them at the right orientation, the right set for the right side of the vehicle, so on and so forth. They should just pop right in. No big deal. The clip should already be in place when you're putting the pads in place. If you're having trouble with the pads going in, it might be something to do with the clips. Because I didn't have to replace them or clean them or anything else, I left mine in. So sanity check that as well to make sure that your clips are in the correct place if you're having trouble with pads. Go ahead and take one of the brake pads and press it up against the caliper, and take a C-clamp and tighten it until the caliper is completely recessed so that we can put the full brake pads in and they'll fit in place. Apply your preferred brand of brake grease to any place where metal is going to touch metal. Remember, do not put it between the brake pad and the rotor. You would not believe how many times I've seen that happen. Rotate the caliper back into place. Now's the time to put the pins back into place. This is where I'm going to replace my top pin. This is also where you should be checking to make sure you have a thin layer of grease everywhere it's supposed to be. Remember to grease the caliper guide pins whenever you're putting them back in. Make sure you grease the stem but not the threads. If you grease the threads and not the stem, the brakes can lock up or the pin can actually work itself loose. which leads to a real bad time where you don't have brakes and you're going 90 on the freeway. When you're tightening the caliper guide pins, make sure to use a hand tool and not a power tool. Because if you use a power tool, you might accidentally over tighten it to a point to where when you have to work on it later, you'd need a power tool to take it off, which you might not have on hand. The caliper guide pin should stay in place with the amount of torque that you can put on it with a hand tool. We're going to remove the jack stands. Now we're going to put the wheel back into place. We're going to remember to put it on as we marked it so that we can maintain that balance. We're going to hand tighten the nuts, then tool tighten them in every other nut pattern. And then we're going to lower the jack until the tire is touching the ground, but leave the jack in place for now. Now that we have the resistance from the tire touching the ground, we're going to take another pass at those nuts, either using a 4-way or an impact tool like I have here. We're going to tighten them as hard as we can and in every other nut pattern. And once we're done with that, we can go ahead and completely lower the jack and remove it. If you're done with both sides of the vehicle, it's time to put some pressure back on those calipers so your brakes work whenever you try to drive it. Go ahead and get inside of your vehicle and pump the brakes until they're firm, 1 pump every 5 seconds. For some vehicles, for this to work, you need to have the key in the accessory or on position, or even the vehicle started. It's a case-by-case thing. With my Nissan Pathfinder, I went ahead and turned it on to pump the brakes just in case. Now that the brakes are pumped up, go ahead and remove the wheel chocks and make sure that you're clear to move the vehicle. And take it on a short test drive around the block or so. And make sure you don't go too fast, because if you have a brake failure, you don't want to have a catastrophic accident. You should only take it on a test drive if you're confident in the job you did, and if you have tested it a few times while pulling out of the driveway. If you're having trouble with it, pulling out of the driveway or pulling away from the curb, immediately stop and inspect what the problem could be. Now that you've tested your brakes as you've pulled away from the curb or out of your driveway, and you've survived your test drive, it's now time to give yourself a pat on the back and drink whatever your preferred flavor of beverage is. I'm going to go have a lemonade. Thanks for watching. I hope this video helped you out, and if you have any constructive criticism, please leave it below. And if you would be so kind, please like and subscribe. I will be doing more videos like this in the future.